We're very pleased tonight to have with us Josef Briffa, who is a Jesuit from Malta. He has been trained in different places, in Malta, in Italy, in Rome, and in London. He passed a PhD in archaeology in 2017. And so we are very happy to have him here. He is part-time in the Biblicum here in Jerusalem, the Institute, and part-time in Rome. So we have been sharing about possible collaborations in the future. So we are very pleased to have you, Josef, and his home here. As you know, we have a seminar of Dominican scholars in scripture, so coming from different countries, and some friends of the École as well. So we are very pleased to hear you. Try to keep 50 minutes.
Yeah, should be okay.
I mean, more or less, and then to give time for discussion, and it's always interesting to have some time to share, to be able to stop at 7:50.
Okay, yeah, that should be fine. Well, first of all, many thanks, Father Jean-Jacques, for these very kind words of introduction. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here at the École to speak basically about my doctoral research, and many thanks for all of you who have opted to be here, including, I see quite a few of my own students. Well, I defended my PhD 2 years ago now, but, you know, then doctorates are never quite complete. As I was reminded time and again during my final year of thesis writing, the first quote I put here is a gift from my brother, paraphrasing Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings and many other films. The second cheeky but very real reminder about thesis writing, and in this classification my dissertation so far is good, in the sense that it was good enough for my examiners at least, and so in that sense approved, but on the way hopefully to becoming great as I work away on rewriting the PhD into a more readable monograph. I think all of you are familiar as to how doctoral works tend to be pedantic by nature, and so not quite the best thing to sit down and read. Choosing the image for the poster for tonight's lecture gave me a good starting point. Actually, partly for copyright reasons, I had to find a picture that I could have easy ownership of. So in our own museum at the PBI here in Jerusalem, we have this exemplar of a figurine of a very typical Judahite type, a figurine that, as far as I can understand, is yet unpublished. Anyway, nothing too much to write home about. We have very little information about it other than what is written on the base. Dura, près de Hebron, tombeau. At least some sense of context, a tomb at Dura, a town near Hebron, and since the writing is in French, which it suggests to me, knowing the history of our institute here in Jerusalem, that it was acquired several decades back when our house was primarily Francophone. It also reflects the perennial fascination with figurines. In building their study and teaching collection, the Jesuits too wanted one example of such a figurine. And figurines, of course, fill the showcases of museums. Here are the ones in the Iron Age section of the Israel Museum. The ones at the bottom left, sorry. Where are we? The thing got too fast. The ones here at the bottom left are the first type that springs to mind when we speak of figurines, the Judean, or perhaps rather Judahite, pillar figurines. As we shall see here, this type is not the only one, which is why I speak of Figural world in the title, with a focus this evening on Judah, but I shall return to this. There is no dearth of studies about figurines. They have fascinated researchers since the first examples came to light in the 19th century, actually, and especially as in many excavations during the 20th century. Quite a few doctoral theses have been written on the topic, and many studies, particularly on the religion of Israel and Judah during the Iron Age, include some section on figurines. Well, this should come as no surprise. We can agree that in the biblical text itself, it is quite clear that ancient Judahite religion is complex. It is understandable, therefore, that biblical scholars and archaeologists were trying to find some realia, some objects in the real world that could shed light on this problem, and figurines, of course, seem to provide some proof for this in the ground. And figurine studies as an industry is quite alive and well, not only for the southern Levant, but there are dedicated societies like the Association for Choroplastic Studies and the dedicated session of the Archaeological Institute of America. I certainly know of a new book that is bringing together papers presented at sessions of the Archaeological Institute of America that are due out over the coming months, at least if I'm not mistaken, it's those sessions. But a book is due coming out with Brill, and the Journal of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel is certainly planning an issue dedicated to these figurines. So with so many studies already out there, you might rightly ask, why return to this topic? Why this fascination? Was there even space for another thesis? And for me, at least, the answer is threefold. Firstly, the period itself. The kingdom of Judah during the 8th and 7th century is interesting, and I imagine we may quite agree a formative period for the Hebrew Bible, for the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, the so-called Deuteronomistic history, as well as the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Beyond this, and perhaps more importantly, this seems to be a formative period for the theological ideas that will be fundamental in shaping the Jewish understanding of God and sharing the same roots, of course, our own Christian understanding. Secondly, figurines are in themselves fascinating. On some deeper level, that is not so immediately easy to explain, we humans are fascinated by miniature representations of ourselves and of the world. When even a fragment of a figurine is found on excavation, it attracts plenty of attention, disproportionately so, dare I say, despite an often less than meaningful context. Figurines are often associated with religious practice, although as you will see, I'd like to problematize that question. Thirdly, and perhaps more importantly for my PhD project, I felt that there was a need for a paradigm shift. I think one of the professional hazards of academia is consensus. Lulling ourselves into the comfort of an accepted academic position, simply perpetuating what has already been said, becoming a sort of academic dogma. In research of every kind, I believe it is fundamental to question, to ask again and again. Well, let me start therefore with the standard view. Before going any deeper, of course, let's see the general context. My focus is the 8th and 7th centuries BC, when both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah feel strong Assyrian pressure. Israel first, the northern kingdom first, loses a sizable part of its kingdom in 734, 732, and a mere 10 years later or so, with the fall of Samaria, it is wiped completely off the map, as the former kingdom is transformed into provinces of the Assyrian Empire with significant deportations of the population. Jerusalem itself will survive this onslaught, well, just about, as in 701, as we know, under King Hezekiah, the southern kingdom is severely reduced, essentially remaining little more than Jerusalem and the southern hill country. It will partly recover until this kingdom too will cease to exist with the fall of Jerusalem and the exile in Babylon in 587, 586. In this context come the figurines. The idea of figurines themselves is, of course, nothing new and nor so particularly specific to Judah. Yet excavations have yielded a surprising number of figurine fragments for this period, admittedly in a number that cannot be simply accounted for by the choice of where and what has been excavated. And the figurines of Jerusalem and Judah can be grouped into three main groups, well represented by this trio that I picked, that comes from tombs in the Judahite site of Lachish in the Shephelah. Firstly, the female pillar figurines that we've already seen, often called Judean or Judahite pillar figurines because they are so typical, actually, of Judah. Secondly, horses with or without rider, and occasionally some other animals. And thirdly, models of inanimate objects, particularly couches and chairs. Well, what is the standard reading? I will paint a picture here with a very broad brush, which of course is slightly reductive, but reflects reasonably well the literature on the topic. Firstly, the understanding that the figurines are somehow cultic and often linked with popular religion. Secondly, most of the research has strongly focused on the Judean pillar figurines and read them relating to female and household religion. Thirdly, relatively little interest in the other figurines when comparing to the vast literature on female figurines. The major exponent on Judean pillar figurines, in particular in the last 2 decades, has been Dr. Radz Kletter, who has proposed reading these figurines as representations of Asherah. Kletter was not particularly original in this proposal and follows in a long line of interpretation. For example, William Foxwell Albright and James Pritchard that looked at female figurines and linked them with female deities and female concerns. In their case, not specifically with Asherah. That's something that, in a sense, Kletter adds. To be fair to Kletter, his PhD work makes an important and interesting contribution, but has tended then to end up being misdirected. Because the original PhD project was not actually about the figurines and their interpretation, but rather about material culture that could help discuss and define the borders of Judah. Kletter convincingly shows how the prevalence of the female figurine types with breasts and a molded and pinched head, is typical of Judahite contexts. Unfortunately, the interpretation regarding their meaning, which was very tentative in the monograph itself, in Kletter's own words, it is not proven and should not be taken for granted. This interpretation has become in some circles, and in Kletter's own later papers and chapters, almost an established dogma, presumed correct, and hardly discussed. Well, established dogmas, of course, need to be questioned. Often on close analysis, we may notice that they are based on questionable premises. In the case of the Judahite figurines, this can be quite clearly shown to be the case. Firstly, the Judean pillar figurines are read in isolation from the rest of the figurine repertoire, at least in most cases and in most studies. Secondly, in line with earlier authors like Pritchard and Albright, there is an underlying presumption of continuity between the plaque figurines of the Bronze Age, of the late Bronze Age, which were exclusively female, and the pillar figurines. Thirdly, a rather simplistic line of interpretation, that figurine has breasts, therefore it is female, and so, therefore, it is linked with fertility concerns, and therefore it must be directed to a goddess. Fourthly, in Kletter's sense, there is an assumption that we can therefore link female figurines to a female goddess, and therefore, in Judah's case, Asherah. Now, let me preempt any misunderstanding on this. I happen to be one of the scholars who is more than willing to think that the good Lord was happily married until, the late Iron Age, and that there is sufficient indicators both in the archaeological record, such as Kuntilet Ajrud and Kirbet el-Kom, which I show here, as well as in the Hebrew Bible itself. But that, of course, is a completely other debate that I will not delve into tonight. Fifthly, there is no necessary connection between female figurines and female divinity. This type of gender division reflects far more the gender divisions in the heads of 19th and 20th century scholarship, where men go to war and women stay at home and have kids. Moreover, even if this may well be the case in antiquity too, it is not necessarily mapped so in the world of the divine. In the ancient Near East, for example, Anat is a female goddess, but a goddess of war. In ancient Greece, Athena is a goddess of war, and moreover a virgin. And if I think of more recent Catholic examples, so I bring an example from home, from us Jesuits, how do you explain that in Spain, Saint Ignatius of Loyola is patron saint of pregnant women? Unless you are aware of the miracles attributed to him. And in this sense, of course, we need to concede that often enough we are missing a lot of this narrative that goes with the figurines. Kletter's secondary suggestion was also that figurines had some sort of apotropaic use, a sense of warding away evil. His argumentation in this respect is unfortunately rather weak. Kletter links the figurines with good white magic because of a good outward shape. The figurines smile, they have a full face offering their breasts. And I think in this it is rather a pity that he strays away from more secure ground Perhaps more interesting is a more recent PhD work by Erin Darby. She presented in 2011, it's published in 2014, where besides studying the archaeological context, which is particularly important, Darby provided a detailed study of figurine rituals from Assyria, which shed light on potential use of figurines. I underline that potential. The study itself is very interesting, but the very different type of figurines, including the fact that the ones from Assyria seem to have been only ephemeral items made for one occasion and then completely destroyed, indicates that the phenomenon that we have in our hands in Judah is actually rather different. A third interpretation that has been proposed, especially for animal figurines, is that they can be playthings, toys. So, for example, Albright already includes this. This label often meant that more as a means of dismissing their significance. And here I think that Roger Morey is actually quite correct, and I quote, "That a terracotta might have been a children's toy is arguably the least interesting that which might be said of it, and no justification for then dismissing it out of hand as a cultural signifier within the society where it was made." I think it's enough to consider, and there are plenty of studies, by the way, in anthropology on toys and their meaning, but we actually realize how much the toys say something quite strongly about the societies that make them, that use them, that buy them, that sell them, and that actually they're much more meaningful to understand society than we care to admit. The difficulty, of course, is that each possibility has some merit, and we might say that every one of these answers can be equally true. So far, we have no real way to differentiate between the various options, so the naked truth is that we don't really have an answer, but merely plausible hypotheses. This is where we need to get back to the drawing board and think again. Well, as often happens during a PhD, some of the more interesting ideas start maturing at the end, when it's time to wrap up and hand in. In my case, and this was the case, and actually I hope to expand on it in the monograph. In my case, it was semiotics and how a better semiotic approach could help us talk sense about the figurines. How is meaning constructed? How can things be interpreted? I could, of course, take a more serious academic approach. I should, in that case, start with Saussure's model of the signifier and the signified, or perhaps Charles Peirce's model of the sign. I could then move into Umberto Eco's model of infinite semiosis. Of course, Eco is perhaps better known for his novel, The Name of the Rose, but he has written very important, and dare I say, extremely impenetrable works on semiotics. But I will spare you that. It is rather late in the day and I don't want you to doze off. So I'd rather introduce you to the problem in a different way, to the problem of the Scottish toilets. And it's great to hear a few giggles in the audience. At least wasting some time on social media has its use. I find this figure extremely useful here precisely because it serves its purpose whether we actually get the joke immediately or not. Such humor can only work where a common, in this case, visual language and a common cultural register is shared. Even a simple joke like this is underpinned by a number of shared assumptions. Firstly, that we know the difference in the standard signage between toilets designated for men and women. Secondly, the understanding that the standard sign refers to gender rather than dress, such that a woman wearing trousers or a man wearing kilt or cassock or religious habit knows perfectly where they should go. Thirdly, a knowledge that a Scotsman wearing his kilt, that Scotsmen wear kilts, and that wearing a kilt does not make them necessarily question gender or orientation. While it is clear to us that such a baggage is required to understand a simple joke, it is often presumed that Iron Age figurines can be read easily. Dare I say, even naively. Since the cultural register is generally lost to us, is there any hope to understand the figurines? One option that anyone who has been or is going through a doctorate sympathizes with is to feel that it is an impossible task and basically decide to move on. No. I think it helps when you're too deep in the project to pull back. So you have to think outside the box. And possibilities may come in interesting ways to find a coherent way of or how to articulate elements that we may actually know intuitively. One such inspiration for me I was studying in the UK, came with a visit to this particular place in Oxfordshire. Perhaps some of you may have recognized the place because it has received far more exposure in recent years thanks to the film The Imitation Game. Well, it is well known today, but it was absolutely classified information in its heyday during the Second World War. Bletchley Park was the cipher school that was instrumental in decoding encrypted German messages, particularly the Enigma code, and provided the Allied forces with precious intelligence. You may be rightly wondering, however, what can Bletchley and semiotics teach us about deciphering figurines, if you allow me to turn. I think, first of all, it's context. We actually know this intuitively in case of languages and images. It is far easier to decipher the single term within a wider context rather than in isolation. Secondly, repetition. A message that is repeated, and that is repeated with slight variations, is easier to crack. And often the predictability of certain messages actually made them easier to decipher in the case of Bletchley. Thirdly, traffic analysis, which is where is the message coming from, where is it directed to. This was all useful, at least in the case of Bletchley. So how can we apply the lessons of Bletchley and those of semiotics to a better understanding of the figurines? Can we dovetail these ideas with others that come from figurine studies and from archaeology to provide at least a solid theoretical and methodological framework? In my study, I considered the following. Well, let's start with the figurines themselves. Of course. Many previous studies, after all, had a strongly iconographic focus. It is important, I think, to bring to clear focus the issue of repetition and variation. The figurines clearly fall within a predetermined set of types, yet have considerable variation. In this respect, considering the different variables, we could perhaps determine what is meaningful within the code and what is accidental. Often overlooked is the performative value of the figurines. Now, can we look at the figurines not merely as static objects? Of course, for an archaeologist, then it's always about context, context, context. An object out of context loses a lot of its potential meaning, which is, I think, a big part of the frustration, besides a lot of other ethical aspects, a big part of the frustration of archaeologists when we have to deal with cases of looting and antiquities market, which robs objects of their context. And I think also the frustration of curators who have to deal with legacy collections, often with precious little contextual information. And by context, I mean primarily archaeological context. Where was the object found? On a site level, can we distinguish between primary contexts, so for example, where the objects were actually used, deposited, perhaps even first dumped, and secondary context, where often figurines come from later fills, where the context itself is actually quite meaningless. On a regional level, we may look at repetition and variation, within the broader geographical picture, fitting the figurines of a specific site within the wider framework on in the case of the sudden event, in my case. But also context within the figurine repertoire itself, since individual figurines do not stand in isolation, but actually form part of this repertoire. Earlier, I mentioned how doctoral work is never quite complete, even with the title conferred. One of the major changes that there will be between my thesis and the monograph is a stronger emphasis on the figurines from Kathleen Kenyon's excavations here in Jerusalem. Well, considering the importance of her dig undertaken between 1961 and 1967, and the sheer number of figurines, around 670 fragments by my last count, It is odd that the figurines have never been systematically published, and that few researchers have returned to the Kenyon archive in Manchester. This photo actually is from the registers of finds that are held. The Kenyon archive is actually held at the Museum of Manchester currently. There is plenty of information out there on the figurines. Tom Holland had included them in his 1975 doctoral thesis in Oxford, but context was clearly not high on Holland's mind, and the thesis does not include either registration number or locus number. Only the figurines from Cave 1 in Jerusalem were ever fully published, but I will return to these later. Ratzkletter, whom I've already mentioned, uses Holland's thesis extensively and manages to add some contextual information, especially with material at the IAA. His published monograph, however, as I've already mentioned, focused on the Judean pillar figurines. Erin Darby, whom I've already referred to, on her part uses both Holland and Kletter and integrates some more contextual information from the published reports. And the published reports themselves actually are quite meager on figurines, considering that in many cases there's a dedicated chapter in the reports. Here, in this case, only Cave 1 is really fully published, and even here the exact context number is missing. The figurines are also published for Tushingham's report in Area L in the Armenian Garden, and Steiner includes the figurines from Area A, the southeastern hill, today more usually known as the City of David. The information, though, remains very scattered. With the finds registers, on one hand in Manchester, and Holland's work, as part of my thesis research, I have managed to increase this contextual information by bringing things together for Holland's listed figurines from 115, of which 83 were from Cave 1, to 483, just simply by a bit of patient donkey work in the archives, comparing pictures and figurines. This concordance, of course, is serving as a basis for a new comprehensive catalogue that will be part of the monograph. Well, moving on to the figurines themselves, the figurine types from Jerusalem are as expected for the region. Anthropomorphic types with molded heads, number 1 here, up there, or pinched heads, generally with breasts, occasionally holding some object, sometimes a rider, sometimes a rider or other types that are not necessarily most clearly defined. And it should be noted that most figurines are found in a very fragmentary fashion, which makes it harder to compare like with like. Among other types are horses with or without rider, and other quadrupeds with hardly any detail, sometimes, as in this case. And some zoomorphic figurines were clearly spouted and formed part of vessels, although numerically actually these are relatively few. Occasionally there are some other types, such as birds, couches, as I've mentioned, rarely a shrine, this kind of box. That one, if I remember well, is from Cave 1. As I have noted earlier, it is important to remember that the figurines form a repertoire, often a rather limited set of types that I present here in the form of a tag cloud. I think it is preferable to present them in such a non-structured format, to avoid the usual discourse that tends to subordinate one type to another. If they are considered a repertoire, then it follows that it is more likely that we may understand their meaning if we consider them together. And here Roger Morey is quite right and quite apt in his observation. The figurines are like chessmen, I quote, "The figurines are like chessmen, scattered randomly without either surviving boards to give them coherent relationships or guidelines for acting them out in ritualized play." My own study of the figurines, at least the part on Jerusalem, was based on 729 figurine fragments that could be stratigraphically dated to the late Iron Age in Jerusalem from the excavations of Shiloh and Kenyon on the southeastern hill, of Avigad in the Jewish quarter, and the Mazars below Temple Mount. Adopting such a stratigraphic criterion was important methodologically. If any statistical comparison is to be attempted at all, it is necessary to provide some level of context. Well, the table here, I'm quite sure, is not exactly quite readable, so I think a more graphic presentation could help. And a quick glance shows that the zoomorphic figurines here, this big chunk in orange, which essentially are horses or generic quadrupeds, outnumber the anthropomorphic types by about 69% to 23%. So really, if you had to plot them, in orange is the zoomorphic, in blue are the anthropomorphic figurines. Since, as we will see, there is no way of separating the types by archaeological context, any discourse that isolates the anthropomorphic female figurines from the rest is actually methodologically vitiated. To follow the chess analogy, it would be like trying to figure out the rules of chess, ignoring all the pawns. In the case of archaeology, as I've said, it's context, 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 a bit like a very cold case CSI. Which is why I shall now focus on two small areas of the southeastern hill of Jerusalem, the so-called City of David, taking a closer look at archaeological contexts where such figurines were found. Firstly, since so much has been written about it, is Cave 1 of Kenyon's excavation in Jerusalem, here marked with the yellow arrow. It's important to return there. Secondly, I will briefly consider, primarily to give some sense of comparison, Area E of Shiloh's excavation, as it can provide a relatively wide area of excavation datable to the 8th century BC. Well, any discussion of figurines has to start from Cave 1, since the number of figurines found since it is one of the places where, a large number of figurines was found in a single context, and it has had an impact on figurine studies. Well, one of the rules of field archaeology is that the more interesting contexts are likely to turn up at the very end of an excavation season, and when time and funds are about to run out. And this was the case, quite certainly, with Cave 1 of Kenyon's expedition. If I'm not mistaken, Kenyon had actually had to extend for a few days, her season, just to manage to finish off the work. Because, of course, once you find such an important place, basically that was the last work that she did in 1967. Kenyon herself interpreted the Cave 1 as a favissa, a dump for ritual material relating to some sanctuary. She understood Cave 2, the entrance is shown here, not too far off, and the surrounding complex as a sanctuary of some sort. So she read Cave 2 itself as a favissa. These actually are things as found at the entrance of the cave. She understood this structure in area S as some sort of an altar type installation, and the two pillars here she understood as matzebot. Many scholars have long disputed her reading. The two pillars here may simply be there to support a roof, and the installation on the upper ledge may have well served a far more mundane purpose. Well, other readings have been offered for Cave 1. Margriet Steiner has suggested that Cave 1 was a popular cult center, similar to the equally problematic locus E207 in Samaria, surrounded by a guest house. More recently, Erin Darby has suggested that the cave may be linked with pottery production. However, while the idea sounds interesting, none of the items that would generally be associated with pottery production, wasters, basalt wheels, slag, ochre, have ever been found there. So why all the excitement about Cave 1? The answer lies with the sheer number of figurines. Figurines of the various types were found in Cave 1, the Judean pillar figurines and other anthropomorphic types here in the red box, horses and riders here, the yellow section, as well as the birds here in blue, well, not the clearest at a distance, so bird types, and as well as other models and cultic material, such as, where are they? Next page, I think. No, sorry. I forgot to include some of the material, but anyway, there are also some models of couches, model shrine, a fenestrated stand, and so on. So taking all the data into consideration, what can be really concluded about the cave? The simplest and the least interesting answer may quite well be the right one. Firstly, considering the joins between fragments, the figurines were broken before being dumped into Cave 1, as some figurine fragments join with others in rooms close by. Secondly, the pictures of the cave as found shows a total mess, suggesting dumping. Here I think the trench supervisor's observations in the notebook are rather pertinent. To my knowledge, this quotation has actually not been published in the reports. There appear to be more vessels closer to the entrance than further in. Does this fact, coupled with their haphazard grouping, suggest that they were cast in from the entrance rather than carried in and carefully placed? An objection may be raised, of course, that it may well be a dump, but especially ritual one, considering the number of figurine fragments. After all, Kenyon's description of the context as a favissa meant that she did understand it as a dump, albeit a cultic one. Within Kenyon's area itself, this view may be justified, as figurine fragments were present elsewhere, but relatively few. The picture changes, however, once other areas are included in the discussion, which is why I now move to Area E of Shiloh's excavation. It does provide us at least with some measure of comparison. Even a cursory glance at the distribution map of the figurines is rather telling. The sheer number of figurine fragments found all over the area is quite striking, and these cannot be immediately associated with one structure as opposed to another. Equally striking is the general spread of figurines, such as it is hard to pin down, dare I say impossible to pin down one particular type to one particular building, but rather that the repertoire is spread all over the site. And taking into account this wider context, therefore, Cave 1 suddenly is less surprising and less particular. Actually, if one wanted to argue for an immediate cultic connection, a potential shrine was identified by the excavators of Area E in locus 1667, which should be, which is this locus here. Ironically, however, only animal figurine fragments were found in the same room rather than anthropomorphic ones, contrary to the received wisdom, where usually it's the anthropomorphic figurines that are considered more likely to be cultic. Considering, however, how ubiquitous animal figurines are, this is hardly the basis for any solid argument, of course. Well, opening the perspective from Jerusalem is fundamental to place the discourse of the figurines in a wider regional context. It must be said, for example, that while the Judean pillar figurine, as identified by Kletter, is typically Judahite as a stylistic type, the figurine repertoire fits well with the general set of types that are common throughout the southern Levant. Female figurines, musicians, especially holding a hand drum, horses and riders, with occasional types being restricted to some sub-regions, such as boats, well, unsurprisingly found at Ahziv and Tel Kaysan, both on the Mediterranean coastal plain in the north, today in the Galilee. It is important, therefore, not to isolate the Judahite figurine phenomenon from the rest of the region, as what was happening in Judah and Jerusalem did not happen in isolation. Unfortunately, a close study of the material shows the difficulty in comparing material statistically. Before we can start and comparing material and numbers, we need to set a level playing field. Any statistical comparison needs to narrow down on the dates from a stratigraphic rather than a stylistic point of view, with sufficient material that was adequately published. In many cases, this is lacking, and therefore the results are by definition quite limited. In my own PhD work, I focused for a site-level analysis on 3 sites, Jerusalem itself, Lachish, and Megiddo, and on 20 sites spread across the southern Levant. If you manage to see them, it's the red dots, for a more regional study, so basically 20 sites from trying to cover all regions. This gave me a total data set of 3,099 fragments that could be stratigraphically dated to the late Iron Age. I'll pick up on 3 aspects here: manufacture, gender, and performative potential. One first aspect that was looked into from a regional perspective was the type of manufacture used in the figurines. I kept to, in a sense, very basic categories, solid pillar figurines, hollow pillar figurines, other solid types, high relief plaques. When statistical tools were applied to the data sets, such as correspondence analysis, the results were interesting but not at all unexpected. What appears particularly characteristic of the different geographical areas was actually the type of manufacture. So, solid pillar figurines are typical of the southern hill country and the Shfala. Here basically the group marked in red. Whereas the hollow pillar types and the high relief plaques were more common in the southern coastal plain, the northern hill country, the Galilee and the Jordan Valley. Well, since past figurine studies have often focused on the figurines as female, it was also interesting to consider how gender is constructed in the figurines. As far as the context could be dated, there seems to be a shift from figurines that are more explicitly marked as female, essentially showing both breasts and genitalia, to ones where gender is decreasingly biologically marked. So, for example, only the breasts being represented, finally to ones where biological markers are completely absent. It is interesting, therefore, to ask whether figurines that are not immediately gender marked, such as this example of the drummer from Ahziv, it's interesting to ask whether they were understood as female, in which case now gender is expressed socially and culturally rather than biologically, and whether it made any difference in the first place to the people who made and used these figurines. From a theoretical standpoint, it is also important to go beyond the types of dichotomies presented by scholars such as Deaver, who seems to divide the world rather rigidly into two, male, female, official, popular. And I think in this respect, contemporary gender theory is rather refreshing. While it is important, of course, not to impose a 21st century worldview on ancient societies, I think it can help remind us as to how gender is very strongly culturally constructed. And in my case, applying Gramsci's semiotic square to explore the possible variety of gender representation beyond, male-female binary. In particular, it is interesting to note that in all the figurine fragments, male sexuality is hardly if ever marked physically. Yet it seems clear that not every non-female figurine was necessarily intended as male, which once more highlights how gender in the figurines is increasingly a cultural construct. Thirdly, a third aspect which may provide a further avenue for research, and I think here I just really touched the tip of the iceberg, is the performative potential of figurines. In this, the figurines themselves can provide physically a useful indicator. Some figurines can stand on their own feet. Others clearly need to be held in some way or other. Others, such as some of the zoomorphic figurines, can be used for pouring. These characteristics provide some indication of potential use of the different elements of the repertoire as part of a performance of some sort. Yes, apologies. This regarded more the shift basically in the way figurines are gender marked, actually. Well, read in the slide, the apparent shift away from high relief plaques towards pillar types may reflect a shift from a figurine practice point of view, where figurines are meant to be handheld, to one where they are meant to be placed. Actually, apologies, sometimes most of these figures are quite the same. Here you can actually see how in the INH2A the plaque type figurines are actually much more predominant. Shifting then in the INH2B and 2C to the more solid pillar figurine types with the plaques that are clearly, you can't actually place the plaque there and expect it to stand on its own feet. That there is that shift, at least in time. Unfortunately, the study was able only to touch the tip of the iceberg in this regard. A major limitation that I've already referred to is often the quality of the data set that is currently available, which depends highly on the quality of excavation and publication. Well, excavations undertaken a few decades ago are slowly coming to publication, so thankfully I could access the excavations by Yaharoni and at Ramat Rahel, which were in process of publication at the time of my study, and the ones at Beersheba, the 3 volumes were out in 2016, so just in time, at least for me to pick up something from that. Just to mention 2 examples, but of course, the more sites are coming to publication, the more it gives us the chance also to look at context, to look at these figurines also, where they come from exactly, and date them not just from a typological perspective. But I see, also making sure to keep the time. Finally, we can draw some conclusions. Firstly, I think, the figurines need always to be discussed as part of a repertoire. No single type can and should be isolated to make sense of a system, of a code. And regional variations, again, can and should be noted, but once again, not in isolation. Secondly, and I haven't delved too much into this tonight, but detailed study of context confirm that they are found in domestic and in some funerary context, which suggests a link with daily life and perhaps daily afterlife, but there is no clear indication that they are cultic, with an impossibility as well to isolate specific types to specific contexts. Finally, I think it is best to read the figurines as a miniature world, asking therefore a new set of questions. What were they choosing to represent, and why? We need to look more, I think, at social identities and values, looking also at texts to see the figurines. Looking at the text, for example, the Bible, not to see the figurines themselves. Of course, there's people who have linked them with teraphim, for example, but on that, takes a whole other topic. But even to look at the text to understand something about the social values of these societies. Such a miniature world may offer a window onto the real one. Looking ahead, I think it will also be important to tease out, as I said, the potential social meaning of the figurines. Research in this respect has generally focused on figurine use itself rather than trying to see what, for example, the biblical text can tell us about the meaning of horses, riders, chariots, motherhood, couches, boats, music in late Iron Age Judah. I think it is unlikely that we will ever really know what the figurines were used for, whether they had a strong religious significance or whether their use was more mundane. However, whatever the immediate use of the figurines, they remain a precious window on the past, in the very choice of what was represented in the figural world and how. Through the centuries, they remain, therefore, a powerful, if enigmatic, conveyor of meaning. Thank you very much.